Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. The topic for our webinar is Feasibility and Implications of 24 States Achieving 100% Renewable Energy Goals Equitably. This webinar is being presented by the Clean Energy States Alliance as part of our 100% Clean Energy Collaborative, and we've got a really great roster of speakers today. I'm very excited for this webinar. Before I pass it over to them, I'd like to go over a few quick webinar logistics. All of our attendees are in listen-only mode. You have a couple of options to access the audio portion of the webinar. You can call in via telephone or use your computer mic and speakers. If you'd like to minimize your webinar console, you can do that by clicking on the orange arrow that you see circled here in this picture. And you can also click on that orange arrow to maximize or expand your webinar console. One thing you might like to do with that is to submit your questions or your comments. We're going to be saving about 15 minutes following our presentations for a Q&A with the audience. And we love to answer audience questions. We'll get to as many as we can. Do type those in when you think of them. A final note, this webinar is being recorded. We'll send you an email with a copy of the webinar recording and a PDF of the slides, probably within the next 24 hours or so. And we'll also post those on CISA's website at cisa.org/webinars. And that's a good URL to know because it's where we also post all of our upcoming webinars, in addition to many, many, many recordings of past webinars. So with that, I'm now going to pass it over to our moderator for today's webinar, Warren Leon. Warren is the Executive Director of the Clean Energy States Alliance, and he will get us started today.
Hey, thanks very much, Samantha. Welcome all. We're so happy to have you here today. Let me tell you a couple things about the Clean Energy States Alliance. We're a national membership organization composed primarily of state agencies across the country. We have members in about 20 states. We do a wide range of programs involving information sharing, identification of best practices, and you could see our members up here on the screen. If we go to the next slide, one of our projects at the Clean Energy States Alliance is the 100% Clean Energy Collaborative. And this project is closely related to the topic of today's webinar. And the 100% Clean Energy Collaborative works with states across the country and other stakeholders who are interested in 100% clean energy at the state level. And if we could go to the next slide, you can see some of the resources we've produced, a wide range of reports on different topics related to 100% clean energy. And we have a monthly newsletter that you can get that tells you about what's going on across the country related to 100% clean energy at the state level. Well, with that as a little background about us, let's turn to the topic of today's webinar and today's speakers. You know, today's webinar topic is a really important one that's going to focus on a especially significant report that was produced quite recently. Now, this report is significant in several ways, both because of the topic it addresses, also because of its findings and conclusions, but on top of that, it's important because of the way it was produced. It was produced as a result of collaboration among a range of very interesting and important individuals and organizations. And we have some of the key folks involved with the report with us today. I'll introduce them to you and then I'll turn things over to them. I'm going to introduce everybody at the same time here. Paula Garcia is Senior Bilingual Energy Analyst and Energy Justice Lead in the Climate and Energy Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists. She evaluates energy, resource, and climate solutions in the electricity sector, and she works to further public understanding of clean energy technologies, policies, and markets. She's committed to advancing energy justice and sustainable development through her work. A second speaker will be John Walkey, who's Director of Waterfront and Climate Justice Initiatives at GreenRoots. He's long been an activist in East Boston on environmental justice and immigrant rights. And for the past 5 years, he's led GreenRoots efforts to ensure a resilient and equitable Boston Harbor waterfront. He's worked in hazard risk assessment and mitigation and natural resource management in Central America and the Caribbean, and he's done that for NGOs, the US government, and the United Nations. Edyta Sitko is Energy Organizing Manager at the Union of Concerned Scientists, and in her role, she works with a team of experts and regional allies to advance equitable renewable energy solutions in the Midwest and nationally. And she also works to strategically engage UCS's science network experts and supporters in campaigns. Bridget Saunders Vial is the energy democracy organizer with the Michigan Environmental Justice Coalition. She entered into environmental justice organizing in 2016. And at that time, she began coordinating public health research around the US-Canada International Bridge construction. She is raised in Royal Oak, Michigan, and she believes in the power of democracy to align our values with our economies and to secure for all the right to breathe and the right to a livable future. Leslee Gutierrez Carrillo is the environmental justice lead organizer with COPAL, Minnesota. She was born in Minneapolis and grew up in Toronto, Canada, and Pueblo, Mexico. She returned to Minnesota to complete her degree in environmental studies. Because forced migration due to climate change continues to be a significant lived reality for frontline communities across Latin America, she feels a responsibility to her community, and she's hoping to pursue a degree in environmental law to continue to do this work for her community. So that's our cast of characters. Let me turn it over to them.
Thank you so much, Warren. Again, my name is Edyta Sitko. I'm the Energy Organizing Manager with Union of Concerned Scientists. I use the she series of pronouns, and I'm calling from Chicago, which is where I'm based. First of all, I just wanted to extend an enormous thank you to Warren and the entire team at the Clean Energy States Alliance for inviting us to present at this webinar today. We're very excited just really happy to have all of you here with us today. So before I turn it over to our panelists to say a little bit more about themselves and their organizations, I just wanted to quickly introduce our agenda just for the panel discussion. So if we can go to the next slide. Well, as I said, we'll start with some quick introductions, and then we'll turn it over to Paula to give us an overview of the analysis and key findings. And then we'll ask the other panelists, Bridget, Leslee, and John, to talk a little bit more about the connection of the analysis to local work, and then cover some of the recommendations that are in the report. And then we'll turn it over to you for your questions. And a bit of we're hoping, to have a really good, robust discussion today, so we want to leave enough time to do that as well. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Leslee.
Hey everyone, good afternoon. My name is Leslee Gutierrez Carrillo. I use she, they, and I am the lead organizer with COPAL. Thank you, Warren, for the introduction. So I focus more on the environmental justice work in the organization. If we could go to the next slide after the agenda, just to show y'all our beautiful team and a few of our base members. This is a photo that was taken at one of our events. And COPAL, we're an organization that does work specifically with Latinx communities in Minnesota. And we are a base building and power building organization, and we also have service as part of our mission. As part of the organizing kind of like activities that we do, we have immigration organizing, we have electoral health and wellness, environmental justice. So we have a wide range of education, and we also have regional offices in greater Minnesota. So yeah, that's a bit of our team. And the reason that we're involved in this work specifically is because of what it looks like for our community to also have access to the benefits of transitioning to renewable energy. And what is that? How do we ensure that communities in the front lines get access to the jobs, the health benefits, the costs as well? So with that energy burden, and we'll be speaking more about that today. So thank you all for being here. I'll pass it on to the next presenter.
Thanks so much, Leslie. So next, I'll invite John Walkey to introduce himself a little bit more and his organization. And if we go to the slide.
The obligatory banner slide. And so GreenRoots is a environmental justice nonprofit. We've been around for about 6 years under the name of GreenRoots, but have a over 25-year history as part of another organization originally, doing environmental justice work in the city of Chelsea, which is just neighboring to Boston, just across the harbor. And we work within the municipality of Chelsea and in the Boston neighborhood of East Boston, which if you've ever been to Boston, you've flown into East Boston. That's where the airport's located. And most, as the saying from the 70s went, when a lot of organizing was going on, East Boston is more than an airport. And so it really is part of our environmental justice identity of the communities that live with the industrial sort of burden that 20th and 21st century life brings. We have been the marine estuary that we are based alongside of on Chelsea and East Boston. It is home to road salt. It's an industrial shipping channel that brings in products like road salt, petroleum, about 80% of the region's home heating oil, 70% of the gasoline comes up the Chelsea Creek, as well as 100% of the jet fuel at Logan Airport. And we have all the sort of other infrastructure that goes along with that. And as COVID sort of laid bare so precisely are the kind of impacts that results in when you have something like a pandemic. We had some of the highest rates of COVID infection at the beginning of the pandemic. It was rivaling some of the boroughs in New York City. And in East Boston, we also had the highest rates for all of Boston of COVID infection. And it had a lot to do with the fact that much of the neighborhood is composed of low-income, working class, people of color, large immigrant population, large Latino population, people who are considered essential workers, but frequently unessential people. And so a lot of our work revolves around that. We've have sort of fallen backwards into the energy democracy movement, precisely because so much of the projects we've been fighting in the past have been related to the energy sector. And so when it comes to things like converting to green energy and clean energy, we're very much in favor of that. And we'll talk a bit more about that later. And I will pass it back over to Edyta.
Thank you so much, John, for telling us a little bit about yourself and the neighborhood and organization. And last but certainly not least, I'll pass it over to Bridget.
Hi all, really good to be here with you all today. My name's Bridget Vial. I'm the Energy Democracy Organizer at the Michigan Environmental Justice Coalition. We're a membership-based organization. We're working to achieve a healthy environment for communities in Michigan that are most impacted by unjust policies. We came together in this current iteration of MEJC in 2011, attempting to implement an environmental justice plan that had been put together under Governor Granholm. That campaign really changed with the election of Governor Snyder. And so the organization has gone through a variety of work streams. I was hired in as the Energy Democracy Organizer when a bunch of different energy fights were coming into a head. And it finally became really clear that, you know, for a membership-based organization of 40 or so folks, this was like the impactful campaign space where we could do something together that we can't do alone. And that's central to all of our work. So, you know, our coordinator was getting calls from folks who were fighting pipelines in northern Michigan. There was a gas plant on the border of Detroit and the neighboring city of Dearborn, right next to a senior center, an elementary school, low-income housing. They were looking to up that permit to pollute. And at the same time, the big investor-owned utility that serves much of Michigan was planning to put forth a 15-year plan to, very slowly start to phase out coal and invest heavily in natural gas, because they've got frack gas pipelines all over the country. So I came into the work under that campaign. We were doing some research as part of the campaign, in cooperation with the organizing efforts. And what we showed, we did a health impact assessment of that integrated resource plan, DTE's 15-year plan for providing energy to customers. And what we showed in that research is that when you look at the benefits of the energy system, so who's consuming energy, who's running their air conditioners, who has energy efficiency, those benefits accrue consistently to white, wealthy communities, suburban communities. And when you look at who's saddled with the burdens, talking about vulnerability to asthma exacerbation, heart disease, lost days of work and school, it's majority Black communities, immigrant communities, low-income communities that are dealing primarily with the burden. And I actually like to use the word low wealth in addition to, or as opposed to, low income, because its debt is also an issue, right? There's so many folks who are in debt to their utility. And that research, I think really builds on a legacy in the environmental justice movement of having to prove the full thesis that race is the most important, predictor of environmental harm, closely followed by income. And that's something that we've, just been proving over and over. And so we're really excited to get into this research because as climate justice organizers, we think of ourselves as visionaries. And, it's so important in this work to be imagining the world that we want to live in, where we want our kids to grow up, right? And so super excited to work on this research and paint a picture of what we hope things can look like in the future in terms of health and jobs when we make the transition to renewable energy. I'll pass it back to Edyta.
Thank you so much, Bridget. Really appreciate that. And then now I really want to excited to turn over to my colleague Paula to introduce herself and a little bit more about this report.
Thank you, Edyta. So hello everyone, I'm Paula Garcia and I use she, her, ella pronouns. I am a senior bilingual energy analyst and energy justice lead with the Union of Concerned Scientists. I've been part of the Union of Concerned Scientists for close to 8 years already. The Union of Concerned Scientists, or UCS, was created more than 50 years ago, and the work at that moment was focused on nuclear weapons. At this moment, we are working in different areas, including climate and energy, food and environment. We have the Center for Science and Democracy. We also work in clean transportation. And basically, what we want to achieve with the Union of Concerned Scientists is make sure that we have a healthier planet and a safer world. And the main reason why we embarked in this analysis is because we wanted to analyze how leadership states can address climate change by reducing heat trapping emissions from the electricity sector, understanding how the impacts of our energy choices affect our daily life, and making sure that we are centering equity in this transition throughout. And back at you, Edyta.
Thanks so much, Paula, and again, everyone, for those introductions. I actually want to turn it back over to Paula to ask you to tell us a little bit more about the analysis.
Perfect, thank you, Edyta. So next slide, please, and the next one. And the next one, please. Samantha?
It's moving a little.
Thank you so much. Perfect. So basically, what we did is that we focus on 24 states that are members of the United States Climate Alliance. And as many of you know, this is a bipartisan coalition of governors that are committed to reducing heat trapping emissions consistent with the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement. And to achieve so, the electricity sector has a key role to play, especially as we think that we need to electrify the transportation and heating sectors. So for our analysis, we look at the implications of this group of states meeting 100% of their electricity needs by 2035 through a strengthened renewable electricity standard. And one thing that is very important to bring to the conversation is that this level of ambition is aligned with the Biden's administration efforts to make sure that we have electricity generation that is carbon-free by 2035, and also resonates with a growing number of states that are already committing to 100% renewable or carbon-free energy, along with cities and with towns and companies and different institutions. Next slide, please. So in terms of the modeling, we use the Regional Energy Deployment System, or REITs, which is an electricity model from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, or NREL. So using this model, we can get to changes in capacity, energy generation, different pollutants, emissions from like carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen dioxide, and also there are like two key pieces from the results that we got from this energy model that we use. First, we look at aggregated level to this group of 24 states, what was going to be a picture if they were to transition to 100% strengthened areas by 2035, but we also look at very disaggregated data for Massachusetts, Michigan, and Minnesota. And then we complement this part of analysis that we conducted in-house with a collaboration with GreenLink Analytics. And basically, through this collaboration, we were able to get to health impacts, looking at different pollutants, and also we look at the monetization of those epidemiological and CO2 emission reductions. The other piece that was very important in terms of the collaboration with GreenLink Analytics is that we were able to get to some macroeconomic data, especially for Massachusetts, Michigan, and Minnesota, in terms of changes in jobs, net jobs from clean energy, and also in terms of changes to GDP, or gross domestic product. And we also look at changes in the energy burden. Next slide, please. And so what we tried to do with the analysis was to think about what are the key policy discussions that are being had right now. So pretty much the first one is like, we call it the no-new policy. The policies that we have in place right now, the plans that we have in place right now, what's going to happen over the next 15 to 20 years. Then our core policy case, it's called the 100% RES scenario. And basically it's transitioning to 100% RES by 2035, paired with electrification of the transportation and building sector. So that's why we are seeing a 50%, we're including a 50% increase in electricity demand by 2040. And that's our floor, because we understand that we need to decarbonize our economy to address climate change, to improve health, and many other benefits. And then some of the conversations that are happening at state level, for instance, in Massachusetts, is like, oh my gosh, the sector that is polluting the most, that is creating the largest amount of emissions, is transportation or building. So we need to electrify those sectors, and let's not worry about the electric sector right now. So we wanted to see what was going to be the picture if the efforts were to electrify transportation and heating, but not cleaning the grid. We also look at a restricted fossil fuel scenario in which we were constraining for Massachusetts, Michigan, and Minnesota. We were constraining new gas power plants after 2025, and we were also accelerating the retirement of coal plants by 2030 in the case of Michigan. And because there is another very important conversation, and it's like, okay, but what about a clean electricity standard? Because isn't there a role for nuclear and carbon capture and storage and other technologies that are much more controversial? but could have a role. So we look at that scenario as well to see, like, so what are the benefits and what are the potential disadvantages of those different scenarios. Next slide, please. So in terms of the results, the first thing is that we found that climate-aligned states can meet 100% of their electricity consumption with renewable energy by 2035. So basically, this is technically feasible. And this holds true even with strong increases in demand due to electrification of transportation and heating. So in our 100% RES scenario, coal generation, as you can look in the graph, so the results for our 100% RES scenario are on the right. And you can see that coal generation essentially disappeared by 2040. And from 2020 through 2040, solar generation in these states grows nearly 9-fold, and wind generation more than 7-fold. The other thing that you can see is that fossil fuel generation doesn't disappear. So in our 100% RES scenario, electricity generation is 73% renewable for the US climate aligned states. And it's not 100% because of the difference between consumption and generation. So although the US climate aligned states meet all of their own electricity needs with renewables as required by the renewable electricity standard, our modeling allows plants fueled by coal and gas and nuclear to continue operating. And this is because the US power grid is interconnected and is allowing the sharing of power across state lines. Next slide, please. So in terms of capacity, in our 100% RES scenario, solar power increases to 8 times in 2020. Solar power in US climate aligned states increases to 8 times the 2020 amount by 2040, and wind power to 5 times. So this basically is a combined solar and wind capacity increase in average of 30 gigawatts per year, and that's closely enough to meet the equivalent electricity needs of more than 8 million typical US households. And you can say, oh my gosh, that's a lot. But that capacity increase is less than the wind and solar capacity added nationwide in 2021. The other piece that is important is that the 100% RES scenario is adding a good amount of batteries for energy storage. And this is very important because we need to match the variable electricity supply from solar and wind to be able to provide resources round the clock, to be able to cover that electricity demand round the clock. And gas capacity increases more slowly, and you can see that coal capacity drops more quickly compared to no new policy. Next slide, please. And a transition to 100% renewable electricity standard is more than just the technology. I am mesmerized with offshore wind, turbines, and solar panels, but a transition to renewables yields strong benefits in terms of health, in terms of climate, in terms of our economies, and energy affordability. So in this case, accelerating the deployment of renewable energy creates new opportunities in the installation of, for instance, solar arrays, wind facilities. And for Michigan alone, our 100% RES scenario creates more than 100,000 additional jobs from 2022 through 2040. And in Minnesota, this transition to 100% creates close to $5 billion in additional labor income over those 20 years. Next slide. So as I was saying, this transition to renewables is more than just the technology. And this shift to 100% RES reduces the amount of harmful air pollution from power plants much more than in our non-new policy case. And so in terms of the graph, you can see that the non-new policy case is the dark line, I think dark blue, I don't know if you see blue in your screen. The 100% RES scenario is the red line, and the electrification without decarbonization is the yellow line. So in our 100% RES scenario, we see that the emissions from power plants in the US Climate Alliance states fall 88% by 2040, compared to only 27% under current policies and plans. And in terms of nitrogen oxides, the emissions fall 77% compared to only 18% under current policies and plans. Next slide. And one question that I would like you to think about is, does your state has policies, has like legislation or regulations to reduce air pollution? Because that's an important part of the picture of moving away from fossil fuels. And these moves lead to approximately moving to 100% RES in these US Climate Alliance states, leads to approximately 6,000 to 13,000 fewer premature deaths, more than 140,000 fewer cases of asthma exacerbation, and 700,000 fewer work days that are being lost due to illnesses from 2022 through 2040, compared to non-new policies and the current plans that we have in place. The value of public health benefits totals almost 280 billion over these 2 decades. Next slide. And the other piece that is very important is the energy burden. So our 100% RES scenario, the results are showing us the average energy burden can be reduced, and the energy burden is pretty much the portion that a household income needs to be spent on energy. So the results for our policy case, as you can see, the red line is the results for our 100% RES scenario, and is showing that the average energy burden across US Climate Alliance states declines from 3.7% in 2020 to 3% in 2040. That compared to 3.3% in the non-new policy scenario. And there is an important piece to this information that we are sharing here, and is that we expect that there are going to be additional savings, because in these calculations we are not including additional savings that could come from the reduced spending on other fossil fuels for transportation or for heating due to electrification. We all know what's the price right now of gas. So this move to renewables can offer more benefits in terms of savings. Next slide. So just as important, cleaning up the power grid can also decrease carbon dioxide emissions. So with the reduction in fossil fuel use in our 100% RES policy, CO2 emissions from power plants in the US Climate Alliance states are almost 60% below 2020 levels by 2040. The reduction with the current policies and plans that we have in place right now is only 10%. And then again, the yellow line is showing us the results for our electrification without decarbonization scenario. And what we're seeing is that this scenario is linked to power plant emissions that are nearly 5 times higher for sulfur dioxide, more than 3 times higher for nitrogen oxides, and more than twice as high for CO2 by 2040 compared to our 100% RES scenario. And if we were to compare the electrification without decarbonization scenario to current policies and plans, the CO2 emissions are even higher by 14% by 2040 compared between those two cases. And lastly, next slide. We also look at restricted fossil fuel scenario, and I just want to direct your attention to the results of this scenario is the light blue line in the graph. And what you can see is that pairing 100% RES with the early retirement of coal plants and no new gas plants produce the strongest cuts to emissions in the direction that we need our power sector to go to meet our climate goals, and it's also going to be helping us to save nearly a decade's worth of harmful pollution. And you can see that the difference between the areas in the graph is very stark. And I will close with that. Thank you so much. Back to you, Edyta.
Thank you so much, Paula, for covering some of those results. There will be, I believe, links shared to the report at the end of the webinar, or you might receive them after the webinar. So we encourage you to check out the full report and some of the state fact sheets for more information. Next, I wanted to actually invite our panelists to share a little bit more about how this research connects to the work that they are leading in Minnesota, Michigan, and Massachusetts, and maybe to highlight some of the results that were particularly impactful for them and their work in their state. So maybe I think I'll turn it over to Leslee first.
Yeah, thank you, Paula and Edyta. This great presentation, a lot of information. Yeah, so for this next part, I just wanted to connect folks to local work happening in Minnesota that's connected a bit on this end. Something that we like to highlight as we've had these presentations is, okay, what is considered renewable energy? What is considered, what's in this category? What does 100% actually mean? And in the state of Minnesota, currently renewable energy includes things like incineration. It includes kind of like some trash. It includes trash to energy. That process in Minnesota, we have 7 trash incinerators, and 7 of those are in low-income BIPOC neighborhoods, predominantly immigrant neighborhoods, and that isn't right. That's something that we want to address to ensure that we realize, like, the contamination emitted by this thing that's deemed renewable energy, and actually they get benefits of being considered renewable energy, and some funding for that by the state, and they're actually causing more harm in certain neighborhoods than benefit. The amount of energy to the amount of pollution that's emitted by each one of these burning plants of trash is huge. In North Minneapolis, I live in North Minneapolis, and we have the Herc incinerator that's right in downtown Minneapolis. And it's literally right beside North Minneapolis, which is one of the cities with the highest levels of asthma in the entire state. But there's also a few different facilities in this neighborhood that contribute to that, which, you know, all together, we in the EJ movement, we talk a lot about cumulative impacts. What is the cumulative impacts of pollution? And why should we allow certain facilities to be able to get the benefit of being considered renewable when in reality they're causing more harm and adding to that pollution and creating like higher impact in the community. So yeah, that's a big way in which we connected back to our work. Like, what is 100% renewable? And I think that's part of our report. Like, we didn't deem incineration as part of this report and this study, but wanting to ensure that in the works of others that are listening onto this presentation, but that's a question that you kind of hold on to, because we want to make sure that there's like a transition that's equitable, that is taking frontline communities into consideration, that isn't bringing more pollution into BIPOC spaces, and that we all fight to change that narrative. Yeah, so that's one way in which we connect it back. I'll pass it back to Edyta.
Thank you so much, Leslie, and really appreciate you bringing the issue of cumulative impact consideration into it. I will pass it on to John to talk. Same questions.
Okay. I guess one of the, it was, with all due respect, Paula, it was a real nerdy presentation, lots of graphs, but one of the graphs that really strikes me as a nerd was looking at that electrification without decarbonization. And you saw that line just still up there with the present, scenario. And so that is really striking for where I am, in Boston. I'm in a basement, a messy basement in East Boston right now. And we are hearing a whole lot of discussion about electrification, and the investor-owned utilities around here are clamoring for more transmission projects, for more infrastructure to get electricity to people, because we have pretty strong winters up here, so we're going to need that if we're going to switch over our heating systems from gas. There's a strong push at the municipal level. Various towns are trying to have gas bans, and they're fighting with the state to allow that to happen. And there are things, the big push, we're really far behind in Massachusetts on having a fleet of electric cars, but it is the big push. And for those of us who are living in environmental justice communities, at least it's sort of scratching our heads, because, well, electric cars are not, we're not seeing anyone driving those things around the neighborhood to any great extent. We have on-street parking. I don't know where you're supposed to plug it in. If I had one, it would be a long walk home. So it's a lot of this electrification, the benefits of that at a larger level. Yeah, it's great that we would remove natural gas from people cooking with it and heating their homes with it, but there's this unintended consequence of the greater need for some of this infrastructure. And in particular, where we really got into this was a project which my usual work is looking at waterfront development in light of sea level rise and climate change and increased storm surge. And right down the street from me, there about 9 years ago, they proposed a high voltage electrical substation on a piece of property that's right on the Chelsea Creek. So at high tide, it's about 100 feet, a little less, away from the high tide mark. And this is all landfill property. It used to be water in the past, and it will be water again in the future. And this, water and electricity typically don't mix very well. And this thing is right across the street from a heavily used playground, about 300 feet away from a densely packed environmental justice community, and living in wooden 3-story houses, very prone to go up in flames. And it's also 300 feet away from an 8 million gallon tank of jet fuel for the airport. So anytime you describe this scenario, it sounds kind of ridiculous. So from a land use perspective, we were fighting that project. And when we got into, all right, well, what is this about this electrical substation? Why do we need one there? We started looking into the system that permits these things, and then the system that makes the decisions as to what do we need to maintain our electrical grid. And that brought us into our local grid operator, ISO New England, looking at the decisions that they were making in terms of plants, what was generating our electricity. And so through that route, we, in a roundabout way, at a very hyper-local kind of impact of an infrastructure project, we started looking at the whole system and realized that this just doesn't make any sense. The kicker was when we found out that this $60 million substation, including any mitigation that we've managed to drag out of them, 100% of that is being paid by the ratepayers. So is it really mitigation when they say, oh, you want us to plant some trees for you? Well, they reach their hand in your pocket, take out your money, and then say, all right, we're going to use your money to plant these trees over here. There you go, you got mitigation. So the more that we looked into how the grid was set up and how our Department of Public Utilities manages the electrical infrastructure here, the more we realized this is not just, it's not democratic, and it's really inefficient, and it's counter to a lot of what we're talking about when we talk about wanting to electrify things and wanting to create a more sustainable green future. And that's where we've really connected with this report, and using it as a tool for getting our message out there.
Great, thank you so much, Sean. Specifically talking a little bit more about the unintended and negative consequences, right, of some of the discussions happening in the space. So really appreciate that. And next I want to invite Bridget to also talk a little bit about how this research connects to the work that they're doing in Michigan, and a little bit more about some of the results that particularly pertain to you.
Yeah, thanks, Edyta. And it's so awesome, I mean, and devastating, but like amazing to hear from John and Leslie and just hear how this is impacting local work in other states. Really always appreciate hearing from both of you. Yeah, I think, you know, John was naming like a threat analysis, right? That like this report brought up, the threat of like an electrification without decarbonization scenario. Definitely hits home here in Michigan, you know, we're the auto state, the auto manufacturers wanna crank out cars as fast as they can and make electric cars the savior of the future. Another threat analysis that like this lifted up for me is seeing, you know, the positive and the feasibility of putting on a new gas ban, right? Like we can get to 100% renewable energy, you know, by 2035, or we can, you know, we can enact a 100% RES. But like to say that we can do it without any gas, I think is like actually probably politically terrifying to the utility companies. It is so powerful. And you know, so our local energy provider, DTE Energy, I mean, they made the Hall of Shame during the pandemic top 6 utility companies who were taking federal money while shutting people off while paying out their shareholders. They are looking for any way to keep profiting off of their fracked gas infrastructure like 30, 40 years down the road, right? So they are invested upstream in fracked gas facilities in Texas and Ohio and Ontario and Pennsylvania. They're processing this gas at some of the dirtiest facilities around the country. And meanwhile, they're trying to justify the continuation of gas infrastructure by pushing carbon capture. We just got calls from comrades in California. They were at the California Air Resource Board meeting last week, and they were like, yo, your utility paid for a study of carbon capture that was lifted up in the CARB report. So, you know, we're fighting them there. We're fighting them on the renewable natural gas front, right? This, you know, low carbon fuels, all of these false solutions on hydrogen. And we know that fracked gas actually has more disparate impacts, more inequitable impacts than coal when it comes to environmental justice. And you know, I would imagine that's because segregation has only intensified over the years. But so, you know, this is a huge threat. I mean, connecting to work that we did recently, you know, we were just working to some extent on the Michigan Climate Action Plan, which here is called the My Healthy Climate Plan. And when the first draft of the plan came out in January, the only quantifiable goal in the plan was to get 2 million electric vehicles on the road by 2030. The plan improved a lot thanks to like people throwing down. But at the end of the day, like they didn't mention gas. They didn't say it once in the whole report, and that's really scary. So yeah, some of the work that we're connecting, and yeah, thanks. I'll pass it back, Edyta.
Yeah, thank you so much, Bridget, for highlighting some of those sort of issues, because there's a lot of things there, right, surrounding gas, electrification, just a lot of different things. So thank you so much for bringing that up. And as we close out our presentation, I would like to actually bring it back to our panelists one more time, just to share, maybe each of you can take 1 minute to share a recommendation that you have from the report, or, you know, how you make use of this information. So I'll pass it back to Leslie first.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yes, I think part of what was linked in the chat by Vero was like the fact sheet and the report. And with the fact sheet for Minnesota specifically, one of the recommendations that I wanted to highlight was the last point, a clean energy future for all. And I can read that super quickly. So to advance racial and economic justice in the transition to clean energy. Minnesota policymakers must ensure that traditionally excluded groups, including Black, Brown, Indigenous, immigrant, and low-income communities and fossil fuel-dependent workers, have power in decision-making and receiving direct benefits from the transition. Honestly, that's the one that I want to highlight, and I think it should be at the forefront of a lot of the work that we do in our organizations, but also in this space as we talk about transitioning to renewable energy, because honestly, if we don't have that in mind and we create the same systems of oppression, we're only going to be seeing harm. I think it has to do much more than just our physical environment, but the people within it, and to make that transition equitable for all, we need to have it at the forefront. So yeah, that's one of the recommendations I wanted to highlight.
Thank you so much, Leslie. John?
I guess one thing that's striking is when you think of the climate crisis that we're in is really the result of this kind of invisible externalization of costs on the part of corporations and the socialization of those costs. So we're going to externalize, and we're going to shove all those costs onto everybody else and extract all the wealth from it. The interesting thing with this report is to be able to do really the whole cost benefit analysis and to see what, if we start being more conscious of all that, what are some of the benefits in terms of some of those green link analytics that came out of this, in terms of jobs, in terms of, in my mind, the health impacts. If we stop poisoning people in these communities, then we have people who are not growing up with asthma, who are healthier, who are able to work, to go to school, to be not spending so much of their household income on medical expenses, going into debt for things like that. That making those connections are really important. So in Massachusetts, we've recently passed a climate bill that had some EJ legislation in there and requiring cumulative impact assessments. And I really would like to see that the concept of go beyond cumulative impact assessments and start thinking about impacts in terms of costs and benefits, so that the case can be made for 100% renewable to our local politicians and say, look at the jobs you're going to get, look at the health benefits that are going to accrue to us if we do this. Where we need to sort of make these invisible costs visible, and then make some of these benefits also more tangible for the decision makers in order to put the pressure on them to do something about this.
Thank you so much, John. Bridget?
Yeah, the last webinar that we did, I think I said something about, recommending that we really need to take on gas directly. And, I think particularly just in light of the political events of the last week, I want to just say, we don't have the power to do what we need to do right now, right? To be honest, corporations are running our climate policy, and the EPA just lost the ability to regulate air emissions. So recommendations from this report, we need cross-class, cross-race campaigns that are strategic, that bring people together across issues that we can build power around. We need to be fighting for objectives that take back our democracy, and we need to be fighting for the kinds of social programs that take on climate and other social justice issues.
Thanks so much for that really, really incredible and important point. Paula?
Yeah, I think that my recommendation is mostly focused on making sure that the urgency of the climate crisis doesn't justify perpetuating inequities in the energy sector. So we need to make sure that policymakers explicitly and proactively drive equity in the energy decisions that are being made, that those decisions make sure that people most impacted also have power in how those decisions are being made, in terms of having access to give you examples, having access to energy efficiency, having access to solar energy and energy storage, making sure that we have a diverse and inclusive workforce. Just 3 of the examples on why we need to be explicit, because there are places like Massachusetts that are leaders on energy efficiency, but then you look at the disaggregated data on who are the ones that are getting those benefits from the energy efficiency kind of services, and the demographics are very stark in terms of, like, as Bridget was mentioning, like low wealth people, a very small percentage of low wealth people are being able to participate in energy efficiency programs, and the same is true for solar, and the same is true for the participation in the clean energy industry. Is very new. We have a huge opportunity to do things right.
Thanks so much, Paula. So this closes out our panel sort of presentation portion, and we do want to have a chance to take some of your questions. So I'll turn it over to Warren to help us launch the Q&A.
Hey, thanks very much for that really interesting presentation. I'll jump right into questions. I want the audience to know, because there's not too much time till the top of the hour. We're going to go till 5 after the hour to make sure we can get a few questions in here. And the answer to the question that came up from several of you, you will all be receiving an email with a link to the slides, a link to a recording of the presentation, and a link to the UCS report. So you'll have all of that in your inbox, in your email within 24 hours. Several of the questions are for Paula, and then I'll also ask some broader ones. Paula, how much confidence do you have in the projections for future hydro generation, given all the droughts in the West and other climate change that is causing hydro generation to decline?
Wow, that's a new question. Ooh, you're putting me on the spot, really. I do believe that there is a very important area of work in terms of climate impacts, and how we're going to be able to deal not just in terms of generation, but in terms of like climate resilience, when we have extreme heat, when we have storms. We have seen what happened in Puerto Rico more than 4 years ago. I think this is going to be a 5th year after Maria. So yes, there is a lot that needs to happen in terms of research, not just like hydro is one of those components. And I'm originally from Colombia, and that in Latin America is one of those big questions. Like, so we have these huge, large hydro projects. What's going to happen as we are seeing the changes in weather patterns? And I think we need more research and get ready accordingly.
Okay, thanks. And when you were trying to estimate the health impacts on communities, did you have to make assumptions about the location of power plants, or was that locational information available through reads or any of the other databases you were using?
Yeah, that's a great question. And yes, we had to make assumptions. What we decided, because the easy way to go about this is when we know that a specific power plant is going to be retired. So no assumptions need to be made there. We have the data. But when you start seeing that there are decreases in the generation coming from fossil fuel in a region, that's when we had to start making assumptions on, like, we didn't assign to a specific plants, but we just on average reduce the generation coming from the power plants in the area.
Okay, thanks. And when you were looking at energy storage and battery storage, were you figuring in the possible availability of batteries in electric vehicles for providing some of that battery storage need?
Oh wow, that's a huge piece. I think that I can say that one of the limitations of our analysis is that we believe that on one hand, energy efficiency is to play a larger role. Our assumptions for energy assumption were not as ambitious as we wanted at the beginning of the analysis. So I want to flag that piece, and also there is more work that is needed in terms of what happens with flexible demand and what happens like with the role of distributed generation. The tools that we were using were not very good at getting to that piece of the equation. Yes, large projects are important, but we need to take advantage of the built environment, and unfortunately, because of the tools that we were using, we were not able to get in detail to what was going to be the role of distributed generation. And to that point, solar paired with energy storage and the non-wires alternatives kind of the picture is something that we were not able to assess properly.
Okay, and this might be a question for anyone. Your results about the decrease in energy burden, the 100% renewable energy scenario does lead to a decrease in energy burden, which is good, but it's still a modest decrease in energy burden. What other things can or should be done to address that issue of energy burden?
I will be brief, but I think that others here have very good ideas, including the how central energy efficiency is for this part of the equation. But I just want to flag that we're talking about a reduction in the energy burden on average as we are investing a lot on new clean energy technologies, on renewable energy, call it solar or wind or energy storage. It's so important to see that as we are doing those investments, the average energy burden is not increasing. I think that that's a super important piece of the conversation that is important to keep in mind, but I will transition with that with others with ideas on the energy burden.
Anybody else want to weigh in on that topic of energy burden?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that we are pursuing, and it relates a little bit to that question of using car batteries for storage, is the non-wire alternatives, the distributed generation and storage. I just was in evidentiary hearings all this week at our local energy facility siting board, and listening to how our local energy provider, investor-owned utility, Eversource, how they talk about modeling those sorts of things. And basically they avoid it. They assume that car batteries will all need to come from the grid, and they will not be sources of reliable supply, of putting back into the grid. So they don't view them as sort of a static battery sort of facility. So modeling those things is going to be very difficult, but I think ultimately getting to address the energy burden question is sort of thinking of what happened in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria, thinking of more distributed generation, of more distributed storage, figuring out ways to sort of redo how we have our energy set up and delivered to us. And in that way, I think right now the major burden is actually the infrastructure of organizational infrastructure that we're supporting, the regulatory infrastructure and the business side of it all. The incentives that are there is actually a larger burden probably than the technical side of it all, although there is a large startup cost to getting the sort of distributed generation infrastructure in place and a smart grid in place that could manage how that flow, because it's no longer a one-way street. It's going to be a lot of traffic, electron traffic to manage in the future. But as we get a better handle on it, I think that's where there will be savings and a lessening of the burden.
Hey, thank you. Go on.
I'm sorry. Just going back to the point about energy efficiency, many of us have heard that the best electron is the electron that we don't have to use. So if we're able to integrate good improvements in terms of isolation, insulation of our place where we live, in terms of more efficient appliances, we're going to be reducing our energy consumption, electricity consumption, and that's going to have an impact in terms of the amount of money that we need to put to pay for our electricity bill, which will help us to reduce the energy burden.
Thanks. Well, I want to end with one last question, which we would be remiss if we didn't address today. The hurdles in front of us to achieve what you set out in your report, and it's a vision that I suspect everybody on the call would agree with. The hurdles have become higher with today's Supreme Court ruling against the power of EPA to regulate emissions from power plants. Does anybody want to weigh in on how we should react to that ruling, or what we can or should do to make faster progress in light of the limited ability EPA is going to have to regulate emissions?
I'll throw in something, and you know, we'll love to hear from others as well. But again, it's like, as climate justice activists, we have to be taking on the attack on democracy, right? Like, we can't sit on the side. It's the biggest barrier that we have to climate action. So yeah, we've got to be fighting to expand the Supreme Court to end the filibuster. We need to be passing, getting involved in the reconciliation package to get wins that center climate and EJ investments. We got to be calling on Biden to stop new fossil fuel projects, right? Using executive action where we have the opportunity to, and taking on false solutions like nuclear power and hydrogen as much as we can in the federal investments that come down. So yeah, all of that and so much more.
Hey, that's maybe a good summary and a good way for us to think about it. So with that, look, let me thank all of our panelists for their interesting and incisive remarks. Thanks to all of you for attending our webinar today. I hope you will follow up and read the UCS report, and I hope you'll attend future webinars for CESA's 100% Clean Energy Collaborative. You can see on your screen an advertisement for a coming CESA webinar. So thanks, everybody. Bye now.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.